Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ignorant Intellectual on Media. I'm your host, Scott, and today I thought we'd do our seventh episode of my CD library. We're full on into the B's and soon to go into the A's of the first box of all the CDs that I removed from the shelves to make way for more films, more DVD Blu-rays, um, and it should be fun. We got 18 CDs today to go through, and it shouldn't take too long. And there's some great albums here, some of the greatest of all time. All right, so uh, let's hit it and see how it goes. All right, so first up is a Canadian band. This band is loved by almost everyone in Canada. It's one of the iconic bands of Canada, up there with the Guess Who in the earlier Canadian music days, and more modern like the Tragically Hip, and it's Blue Rodeo. All right, and I have two of their CDs for this episode. There may be more in my collection. I'm not sure, um, but the two are Lost Together. All right, which came out in 1992, and it's their fourth album. And then the one that came after that is 5 Days in July, and that's their fifth. And this 5 Days in July is probably their best. Now, I was never a big Blue Rodeo fan. I always found the music a bit, I don't know, tame, I guess. It's kind of like a rock influenced country feel to it. Um, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's very good. Some of their songs I really enjoy. You do hear many of their songs on the radio, which may have been one of the reasons why I never really got into the band. I got into them, I guess, enough to pick up some of their CDs and explore their discography more, because most of the music that I've heard from them was, being played on the radio. And they have what in Canada I would call you know, the music doesn't sound the same as Def Leppard, but the idea behind it, when it came to rock radio or any radio, was the same. So if you grew up during the time that I grew up, and when Def Leppard had its heyday, every time you turned on a rock station, you would hear the same Def Leppard songs over and 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 over again. All right, so even if you love Def Leppard as a band, because of the amount that Def Leppard ended up hitting the radio waves, um, you kind of got sick of the band. It was like, my God, another friggin' um, song from Def Leppard. It was ridiculous the amount that they played of Def Leppard on the radio. And the same thing goes for Blue Rodeo. Blue Rodeo was in that milieu genre where you could play them on rock radio and nobody would blink an eye, but you could also play them on the country stations and nobody blinked their eye. And you could play them on the pop stations and nobody could blink their eye. They're kind of like genre expanding, like their music was such that you could play it on any radio station. So no matter what radio station you were listening to, you would always end up hearing Blue Rodeo. All right. And after a while, you would hear the same songs over and over and over again. So like, um, Pour Some Sugar on Me by Def Leppard was just so overplayed on the radio that I friggin' hate that song. Um, uh, Blue Rodeo was similar with much of their music as well. Now, what happens with you is when you're young and you hear the same music over and over and over again, it kind of irritates the hell out of you. And then when you hear songs like that one, or another one was Red Red Wine by UB40. Remember that song? Oh man, that just grates me the wrong way. I heard that song so often on the radio, just want to. Anyways, it just still gives me a physical. Anyway, but usually what happens is as you age, you kind of mellow out, right? And a lot of the stuff that you didn't like in your 20s starts gaining a nostalgia in you, and then you start, kind of enjoying the music that you grew up with more and more. Now, personally speaking, it's my opinion that the 80s were the worst decade of music out of every decade up until the 2000s, right? So the 50s were good, the 60s were great, the 70s were awesome, the 80s sucked, the 90s were good, the 2000s were good, right? So at least that's my opinion. Now, With the '80s being like 40 years ago, right? All the older people like me who grew up in the '80s started getting nostalgia and start, re-evaluating their opinions on '80s music. And I'm slowly doing the same thing. There's a lot of music that irritated me back in the '80s that I find quite enjoyable now. Like guys like like Wham. Remember the? I don't know. See, I don't know how old you are watching this video, but let's say Wham or George Michael, the Faith album. God, that album irritated me back in the '80s, but now I quite enjoy it. But anyway, so Blue Rodeo were just way overplayed. There's a law in Canada saying that you have to play a certain amount of Canadian music if you have a radio station in Canada, and Blue Rodeo was the poster child for that. Um, rule, right? So if you're playing music, you're going, okay, we need to have a certain amount of Canadian content. Not that Blue Rodeo is bad. They're not. They're actually really good. Just ask any other Canadian other than me, right? Um, but you heard their music so often because they were like the poster child of Canadian content, at least in my opinion. On radio, you would hear them in country stations. You'd hear them on pop stations. Anyway, so yeah, so they got heavy radio airplay, and after a while, you got sick of hearing the same songs over and over again. But this is probably their best album, and this album isn't bad as well. If you want to explore Canadian music, explore Blue Rodeo. Don't take my opinion as canon, I guess, because more people love Blue Rodeo than dislike Blue Rodeo, like I do. All right. Well, I don't really dislike them, but I mean, I do have a lot of their CDs in my library, right? I just don't listen to them much. But they are kind of getting a nostalgia thing for me as I get older. All right. It's more mellow, kind of laid back country pop music kind of idea, right? All right. So next up is um, David Bowie's eighth album. All right. That came out in 1984 and it's called Diamond Dogs. All right. And this is a very good album, although it's a bit eclectic and it's a bit, what would you call it? Bouncing around a lot. I mean, according to the stuff I read, this is his last glam album, and then he moves into more soul and funk in his next album, which was called Young Americans. And you see that influence in this. You have some more soul and funk stuff on this album. It's led by Rebel Rebel, which is probably one of his greatest songs of all time, and it's probably the song off of this album that everybody refers to. But he's got like, he was a fan of George Orwell's 1984, and you get a few songs like Big Brother and 1984 on this album, which kind of refers to that book. He also was a big fan of William S. Burroughs, which also has a big influence on this album. So it's a bit all over the place with it, right? So, but if you like Bowie, you're going to like um, Diamond Dogs, and because it's one of his better albums. Now, personally, I've said before in previous videos, his best album is, Ziggy Stardust, but a lot of his other stuff is really great as well. I mean, if you ever look at a list of what are the greatest, albums of all time, you'll have like 5 or 6 Bowie albums on it, and for good reason. He's that good of an artist. All right, so that's Diamond Dogs. All right, next up is the previous video I had, the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club self-titled first album, but it was this album here that introduced me to that band and got me into that band for at least those first 2 albums. This album, it's kind of like psychedelic rock, it's kind of art rock, it's kind of Led Zeppelin-ish in some ways. And this came out in 2003, and it's basically their second album. It's called "Take Them On Your Own." I picked up this as a blind buy, and I listened to it, and I quite enjoyed it. And I listened to it on and off for a few months, and then I found their first album, so I listened to that one as well. Um, but you know how a lot of the times the first album you listen from an artist or a band will be your favorite album because it's the first one that you got introduced to or were introduced to the band from it. So most people um, argue that their first album was their best album, but I kind of like this one better. Maybe because, like I said, it was the my introduction to the band, and then I listened to their first album afterwards. So I kind of have more of a relationship with this album than I do their first. But both of those albums are great. I didn't pursue the band after that. Um, so if I was to make a suggestion for this band, their first two albums are probably their best. But like I said, I didn't go any further. Their third album was well received as well. Um, but after that, so if I end up finding that third album, maybe I have so many CDs in my collection. Sometimes I don't remember exactly all of them. So I may have their third album as well. Uh, I'll see as I go through. All right. So that's Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, 2003's Take Them On Your Own. All right. And next up, we got one of my all-time favorite bands, in a way. Okay. So basically, I probably even have more in upcoming things, but basically, I have five albums by the British heavy metal uh, band, Black Sabbath, one of the greatest bands of all time. Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Ozzy Osbourne. These guys were great, right? And um, I'll show you the five albums. Now I have a sixth album and probably more in the collection. I don't know, but I decorated my wall with wall art, either LP or CD. I stick them on the wall. I'll stick a big nice LP on the wall, and then underneath I'll have three CDs. So their first album, which was a self-titled album, Black Sabbath's first album, which came out in 1970, called Black Sabbath, is on the wall because I consider it one of the greatest albums of all time. And their second album, which is this one, is called Paranoid. And this is probably the most popular album because it has those three songs that if you do listen to Black Sabbath and you're on rock radio or other streaming service and you just put on like a you know the the website's playlist or whatever, you just hit rock and roll and you listen to whatever they play. They'll have modern stuff, but if they go back, they'll end up playing Black Sabbath. And the three songs most played by Black Sabbath are off this album. It's called they are War Pigs, Paranoid, and Iron Man. If you've listened to Black Sabbath, you know those albums, which is funny because um, the album cover, which shows a guy running through the forest with a helmet on and a sword, all right, um, and he's like a shield, and he's like a pig or whatever, right? Um, this originally was going to be called War Pigs, but the Warner Brothers decided that yeah, they're not going to do that because maybe people would take offense because of the Vietnam War at the time. So they changed it and called it Paranoid instead. But then, of course, the front cover of it doesn't make as much sense, right? But anyways, this has War Pigs, it has Iron Man, and it has Paranoid in it. Three of Black Sabbath's signature songs, right? So many consider this the greatest heavy metal album of all time. It's the introduction of heavy metal. Their first two albums kind of um, foreshadowed heavy metal and basically did the parameters of what heavy metal are. So when you're getting into heavy metal, you always end up going to Black Sabbath's first two albums, three albums, four albums, five albums, Volume Four, and what was the fifth one? Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, which is their fifth, which is that one. All right. So their first five albums, canon, uh, Black Sabbath. After that, the band was riddled with drug use, mostly cocaine, but some heroin and stuff. And by '79, they kicked Ozzy Osbourne out of the band because of his inability to work, I guess, uh, because of drug addiction, right? And then what's his name, Ronnie James Dio, kind of took over vocals for a while, and he ended up doing the vocals on this album, which is called Mob Rules. Came out in 1981, and it's Sabbath's 10th album. All right, so but I kind of dabbled in their third, fourth, and fifth albums. I listened to them, but um, here's the thing with every band. Okay, when you end up getting really into music and you start listening to a lot of music, you end up having thousands of artists or thousands of bands, or at least hundreds of them, with thousands of albums that you end up perusing. You end up playing, and you may not go back to a band after you've listened to them for 6 months. You know what I mean? And maybe you'll get the urge. Oh, I haven't listened to Black Sabbath in a long time. I want to listen to them. And what do you do when you return to them because you haven't heard them in a long time? Is you'll listen to the albums that you first listened to, right? Um, so the first albums that I listened to was the first one, which I fell in love with, their self-titled album. I think it's one of the greatest albums of all time, and maybe second behind Master of Puppets by Metallica as the greatest heavy metal album of all time. All right, just the Iommi's playing and Butler's bass, just it the flow of that self-titled album just brings you along. And I love simple music, and the guitar riffs in those first two albums of Black Sabbath, the guitar riffs are really fun to follow, right? So, it's not super complicated music, right? Um, anyway, so when you return to them, you return to the music that you first listened to them, and that is the first two albums by me, especially their first album, right? I went into Volume 4. I went into Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. This one, which is their fifth album, and it came out in 1973. But their original two, their first two are their iconic albums, and the ones that I listen to the most. So when I return to Black Sabbath, I don't really explore further into Black Sabbath. I kind of go back to their first two albums and listen to those ones, and then I'll move on to another artist. So what you end up doing is maybe when you first catch a band and then you start listening to them, you'll listen to all of it, and then you'll end up having favorites from them, and those are the ones that you return to when you listen. You just kind of forget the rest of the stuff, right? So um, every band is that way, especially when you get into hundreds of bands and hundreds of artists that you listen to, right? So, all right. So, but as well, I have Black Sabbath, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Paranoid, Mob Rules, which I mentioned, but other two more. This is their last album, came out in 2013, and it's called 13. All right, and uh, they went through a bunch of lineup changes, but I think this is basically the original lineup, except for the drummer, if I remember correctly. But you have Iommi, you have Butler, and you have Ozzy Osbourne on their last album, which is called 13 because it came out in 2013. All right, and then if you haven't really listened to Black Sabbath and you're wondering whether you like them or not, and you want to pick up well, compilation albums are kind of redundant now on CD, right? Because most people stream music, so if you want to listen to Black Sabbath, just stream it, right? And you can stream whatever you want. But if you like playing CDs in your car still, I mean, I usually transfer everything onto change it into a large MP3 file. And then I'll put it on a flash drive, and I'll just plug the flash drive into the USB slot in my car, and I'll listen to it that way. But if you are going to listen to a compilation album by them to get an idea of whether you like Black Sabbath and you want to explore their discography, this is probably the one that you'll want to pick up. All right. We Sold Our Soul for Rock and Roll. It basically has all their best music from their early days, right? So, and it's not a bad. It's like a double album, but they fit it all onto one CD. All right. And this came out in mid '70s, yeah, 1975. So you had basically the first five albums, maybe six albums represented on that, and that's their best stuff in my opinion. Anyways, their first five albums, and then I think it was five albums, and then you know Ozzy Osbourne left the band or was kicked out of the band, and then they kind of spiraled after that, right? So anyway, so that's Black Sabbath. All right, the beginnings of heavy metal. Next up is I've already talked about this band in a previous video because they're bees, all right? And their best album, in my opinion, is Tiger Milk, which was their first. But you also have, um, I also have two more of their albums. I have If You're Feeling Sinister, which came out in 1996, all right? And this is considered by many as their and the boy with the Arab strap. So if you're going to do a three count of there's a toss up between these three albums, but I think this one is considered by most as their best album. Um, the boy with the Arab strap and Tiger Milk are also way up there. So those three albums, if you want to explore Belle and Sebastian, uh, those three albums are really great. My personal favorite is Tiger Milk, but you can't go wrong with this album. And I also have this album, which is their fifth album. It's called Storytelling, and it's basically the soundtrack to the film Storytelling. All right, and I don't think this is one of their great albums, but if you love a band, you're going to pick up as many of their stuff as you can and listen to it at least once and see what you like. And then, like I said, there's so much music that you listen to and you get a feeling to listen to. When I get a feeling to listen to Belle and Sebastian, I'll listen to those three albums that I mentioned, especially Tiger Milk, right? So you got Storytelling, which is their fifth, came out in 2002. And If You're Feeling Sinister, all right, which came out in 1996, all right. I think this is their second or third album. I can't remember. I didn't write it down. Um, yeah, second album, and then The Boy with the Arab Strap is their third, and then Fold Your Hands, Child, You Walk Like a Peasant is their fourth, right? So, but their first three albums are probably their best stuff, all right? So that's Belle and Sebastian. Um, Next up is one of the all-time great BritPop bands from the 90s. You know that there's a big, um, like competition between them and Oasis back in the 90s, and that's Blur. And this is their album 13, which came out in 1999, and it's their fifth album. If you're going to explore Blur, I wouldn't suggest this album. This album's not bad, but their self-titled album and Park Life. Park Life is probably their best, but a lot of mention their self-titled album as well. Those two albums are probably the ones that you would explore first if you want to get into some Britpop of the '90s with Oasis and Pulp and all those guys. Um, but this album isn't bad as well. All right, so that's 13. Came out in the tail end of the Britpop era of popularity. But if you like Britpop, I would suggest the greatest Britpop album of all time during that period is not Oasis and it's not Blur. All right, it's the Stone Roses, and it's their first album. Their only really good album. They only had two albums because of infighting in the band, but their first album, the Stone Roses, best Britpop album um, from that era, and it's one of the greatest albums of all time. So uh, um, I would suggest you find that one. All right. So next up is Better Than Ezra. All right. It's 1996 album Friction Baby. All right. And this is what it looks like. This is the one that has Desperately Wanting and King of New Orleans, two of their greatest hits. But I don't know why I picked this album. I guess maybe I was exploring music at the time because I'm not a big fan of this band. In fact, if I ended up losing this album, I probably would miss it because I don't think I would ever play it again. But there are fans of Better Than Ezra. I just find this stuff, from the garage days of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and that type of thing, um, good. But I wouldn't go further into it. Not th- This band I don't think is from this band's from New Orleans, but they kind of have that kind of sound like the Nirvana, Pearl Jam, you know, uh, just pop. What was the band that did the song Rooster? Remember that song? Yeah, here comes the rooster. Alice in Chains. These bands, Stone Temple Pilots, that kind of sound music in the '90s. After a while, it kind of got old hearing the exact same music just from different bands over and over. Nirvana and Pearl Jam is probably as far as I went into the Seattle grunge sound. And so these guys kind of have a similar sound to that. And so I never really explored their discography. All right. Next up is Foiled by um, Blue October. All right. And this is the album that had Hate Me on it. for a brief period, I really liked that song, so I ended up finding the album and buying it just to listen to "Hate Me," and I never really went any further in Blue October because the rest of the stuff was like average at best, at least in my opinion. Um, it also has the song "Into the Ocean," which was another hit by the band, but it was that "Hate Me" song that grabbed me at the time, and so I picked up this album just to listen to it. All right. Next up is one of the great pop punk, I guess, um, albums of all time by Blondie. It's their first album, or sorry, their third album. Came out in 1978, and it's probably their most popular album. It's the one that put them on the map. It's called Parallel Lines, and this is the one that has a, One Way or Another. It has a Heart of Glass. So one of the classic um, female-led rock groups of the late 70s, going into the 80s as well. And Deborah Harry, who's Blondie in this, who's blonde, right? Uh, she had quite the career, and it was great. In fact, there's one song later on. What was it called? Rapture. Remember the song Rapture, where she raps at the end of it? Um, that was kind of cool, seeing a white female rap, right? It's one of the earlier, and a lot of people cite that song Rapture as in, you know, I, and when did that come out? Like the early '80s, like 1982, right? And um, I always cite, you know, uh, the Beastie Boys and Run DMC as the popularizing of hip hop into the mainstream. With you got to fight for your right to party, and the one they did with Aerosmith, Walk This Way, Run DMC, right? Those kind of popularized, kind of moved rap and hip hop more into the mainstream, and more people listen to it. But um, retrospectively, I started hearing about, a while back now, but that when Deborah Harry raps on Rapture at the end of that song, it's like one of the first times you'll see a white person rap, right? And then that kind of popularized rap as well, even before, you know, um, you know, ill communication or what was that album by Raising Hell by Run DMC. Those were my two that I listened to, Grandmaster Flash and all those guys, Melly Mel and those guys with like White Lines and those earlier rap songs. But it wasn't until those albums came out in the mid '80s, with the Beastie Boys, um, and Run DMC, that rap kind of entered my life into more dedicated, right? So anyway, so yeah, so the Rapture was kind of an introduction to many white people to rap, and was done by a female on more of a pop punk song, right? Anyway, so that's Parallel Lines by Blondie, which came out in 1978. One of the greatest albums of all time, led by a female, up there with Heart's, Dreamboat Annie, and others, right? And if you haven't listened to them, you should. All right. So next up is Silent Alarm, a 2005 album. It's Block Party's first album. I got into this band for a little bit. I didn't explore any further. I mean, I got into this album for a while, but then it kind of dried on me, and I never really pursued this band any further. So this is basically, I may have a couple other CDs by them, but I haven't listened to them. This is the only the band that I listened to, album I listened to from Block Party, and it's not bad. I don't know how great it is, but I really liked it for a time. And last is two albums by one of Canada's greatest names in punk rock. All right, but he never really got popular until he started doing uh, work in the '90s. And so there's Crawl With Me. It's Art Bergman, all right, Vancouver stalwart musician who was big in early Canadian punk, and Art Bergman's What Fresh Hell Is This, all right. And I have others of his albums. One of his albums Actually, I have up on the wall. All right, because I thought it was such a great album. All right, so Crawl with Me, which is his first album as a solo artist, and it came out in 1998. And Sexual Roulette. What fresh hell is this? Sexual Roulette is the one that I put up on the wall. What fresh hell is this? Is came out in 1995, and I think this is his third album or solo album. Now he was in bands, um, the Young Canadians, or the K-Tels. Okay, if I'm figuring right, they were first the K-Tels, and then they were first the K-Tels, and then they became the Young Canadians, right? Because K-Tel, that label, K-Tel, was going to sue them for using that name or whatever, so they changed their name to Young Americans, and that's when Art Bergman started being known by Canadians in the band Young Canadians. Now they only had two EPs, which were Hawaii and This Is Your Life, but those two EPs were big in the punk community in Canada. And that's where Art Bergman first got his name known, was in the Vancouver punk scene, right? So, but then he kind of went solo and he kind of moved. I mean, he still has punk influences in his music, but his music is a little bit more sophisticated than that, especially in his '90s work, which this kind of thing. It's extremely good. I mean, you should come across Art Bergman. The guy that I kind of when I don't know, I'm no musicologist, whatever. I'm just a music fan, right? But every time I listen to Art Bergman, I also want to listen to Nick Cave. So there's an association between Nick Cave and Art Bergman that fried into my brain during the time that I got into Art Bergman. I also got into Nick Cave, and the music is, I think it's pretty similar. I would have to listen to their stuff again, but every time I listen to Nick Cave, I also wanted to listen to Art Bergman. And every time I listen to Art Bergman, I want to listen to Nick Cave. Now, Nick Cave is not Canadian like Art Bergman. Nick Cave, in the Bad Seeds, those guys in Australia, I would consider Nick Cave um, probably the greatest musician to come out of Australia. Although some people will mention AC/DC or other bands, Men at Work, those kind of things. But I really like Nick Cave when I'm listening to Australian music, if there is a type of thing called Australian music. It's just music, right? Just like Canadian music is music. There's nothing uniquely Canadian about the sound of it or anything. But Nick Cave is great. If you haven't listened to Nick Cave, listen to some Nick Cave, and I think you'll be impressed by him. But like I said, every time I listen to Art Bergman, I kind of want to listen to Nick Cave at the same time. So if you like Nick Cave and you haven't listened to Art Bergman, listen to some Art Bergman. And if you like Art Bergman and you haven't listened to any Nick Cave, listen to some Nick Cave. I think you'll enjoy it because they kind of connected my head for some reason. All right, so that's those 18 albums, the last two being from Art Bergman, Canadian uh, guy, big in punk, but like I said, these albums, less punkish and more, I don't know, like alternative rock maybe, or I don't know how to describe it. The best artists, the greatest ones, you can't really put a label on their music, right? So and he's one of the better ones in Canada, one of the best. All right, so that's it. Got some Black Sabbath, got some Art Bergman, some Block Party, some Blondie, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, so on and so forth. Leave some comments down below if you consider any of these bands your favorite bands. Let me know, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And I'll do an eighth volume in the near future. And you have a good day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye for now.